welcome everyone to this APGRD book launch. Today we are here to hear about, to learn a lot about imprints of dance in ancient Greece and Rome. We have the two wonderful editors with us. We have Zoa Alonso Fernández, who's joining us from Spain, and Sarah Olsen, who's joining us from the United States. My role is to introduce the two respondents. Many people will already know that they are themselves perfect respondents. I'm thinking how much they have in common. Before I introduce them individually, I just want to remind you that they were both professional dancers in an earlier life. They then moved into academia and have performed equally impressively in both spheres. They were both at not the same time, but fellows at the Center of Ballet and the Arts at NYU. But more importantly, and one of the reasons why it was easy for me to invite them to this task today, they both collaborated on projects in Oxford through the APGRD, and particularly importantly through DanceOx, which is, I'm sure, known to many of you, dance scholarship at Oxford based at St Hilda's College. The respondents are going to speak for about 15 minutes each, and they will be followed by responses from each of the editors. We then hope that a number of the contributors who are on this call will also have responses to the respondents. And then we hope to invite the rest of you on the call to put your questions in the chat, and my dear colleague Leo Kershaw is going to monitor the chat and then relay the questions to us at the end. So I'm just going to introduce now the two respondents, and then you will not see me until the very end. The idea is that the respondents hand on to each other and then in turn to the editors. First, our first respondent is going to be Tom Sapsford. Tom, who is based at Boston College in the States. He works, as again, I'm sure many of you know, on performance, gender and sexuality in mostly Greco-Roman antiquity, but also he has worked on the imprint of Greco-Roman performance and particularly dance in the modern world as well. His first book, his extraordinary sort of groundbreaking book, Performing the Knaidos, Unmanly Men in Ancient Mediterranean Cultures, seems to me to be one of those books that are essential to anyone who's working on reception of performance in late antiquity, but also in modernity, precisely because it joins up bits of the history of performance that often have been, or in this case, no doubt, deliberately occluded in the past. And Tom's current project is a book on classics and the gay counterculture from the 1950s onwards, which is again, another groundbreaking and really exciting book that we all very much look forward to seeing in print. The second speaker is perhaps one of my closest colleagues in Oxford over many years. Sue Jones is Emeritus Professor of English, fellow of St Hilda's College. As I say, she is, well, sorry, I haven't yet mentioned, but Sue is the founder and the director of Dance Scholarship Oxford, DanceOx. She has written very widely on Conrad and gender, and finally was able, maybe later in her career, to bring the two parts of her life, her dance practice and her understanding of dance history to bear on her extraordinary knowledge of modernism, and her book Modernism and Dance is really the standard work on that subject. And currently, and I understand very near completion, is a really exciting project on Beckett and dance. So I'm going to hand over now to the respondents, and first over to Tom.
Great, thank you so much, Fiona. Well, what a pleasure and privilege it is here to be tonight. So while a precocious and recalcitrant teenager studying at the Royal Ballet School, I remember getting into a heated discussion with my then dance studies teacher, Dr. Geraldine Morris, about whether a dance could be said to have happened if executed alone and unseen by others. I, a great proponent of the benefits of dancing in one's living room, then as of now, felt that these solitary moments, whether in preparation for pieces to be set on other dancers later, or as moments of exercise, or even as moments of meditation, did indeed constitute both what I understood as dance and its performance. For Geraldine, something else was needed for dance to exist: a venue, an audience, collaborators. Namely, somatic motion in a vacuum did not signify the same thing as what we understand quote unquote dance to be, and rather that this art form is created in relation to geographies, to space, to other dancing bodies, to audiences, and to larger communities. When it comes to studying dance in antiquity, I'm heartily glad for Geraldine's insistence on collaboration being one of this art form's constituent elements. For the one thing that cannot remain in our historical records is the ancient movements of Greek and Roman bodies. Rather, it is through attendant and more durable media that dance's imprints remain. Thus, the volume we're celebrating tonight contextualizes and analyzes the place of dance in ancient Greek and Roman worlds through an archive of literary and documentary texts, as well as visual and material sources. Moreover, in doing so, it successfully bridges the analysis of dance in Greco-Roman cultures with leading scholarship from the last 30 years or so of dance studies. I had the great pleasure of joining the editors and many of the contributors to Imprints of Dance in Ancient Greece and Rome for a dinner here in Cambridge, Massachusetts in April 2022. As Zoa Alonso Fernández and Sarah Olsen make clear in their preface, this volume was realized in the early years of the pandemic, where somewhat ironically, creation in a vacuum was unfortunately demanded of us all. And so the work between these collaborators happened remotely and in a time of historical crisis. Thus, I believe I was joining the group for one of their rare in-person get-togethers, and I felt extremely lucky to have been an interloper as this exciting group of scholars with leading expertise on Greek tragedy, Weiss and Andujar, Roman imperial literature, music and aesthetic theory, Curtis, Fernandez and Schlappback, the body and queer theory, Olsen, shared food, drink, and more importantly, their ideas on that day's workshops on their then emerging chapters. In addition, the volume, but sadly not that evening's dinner, had contributions from Laura Giambitoro Unger and Caroline Laferrière on their specialisms of ancient Greek performance cultures and material culture, respectively. Sat amidst the lively conversation, it was plain to me how engaged and entangled the contributions of and the contributors to this volume were in its still nascent stages. Indeed, Fernandez and Olsen borrow an ancient and bilingual proverb to describe their experience of putting together their bilingual volume, published as it is both in English and Spanish language editions. The proverb, they point out, although meant as an admonishment in the ancient context, proved to be a form of manifesto for them in the modern day. The Greek phrase comes from Plutarch, en allotrio choroi podetithes, and in Latin from Erasmus, in aliano coro pedem ponere, namely, to put one's foot in somebody else's chorus. This aspect of cross-pollination and collaboration is, in a sense, baked into this volume, which approaches the topic of dance in both Greek and Roman cultures thematically. Each chapter with its discrete topic, although written to stand alone, works in chorus closely with its companion sisters. And as I could clearly tell that night in Cambridge, each contribution has been developed in conversation with the others. As my opening anecdote highlights, the definition of what dance is always up for grabs. As Fernández and Olsen point out in their introduction to the volume, their definition is intentionally capacious, extending beyond the highly choreographed, sometimes highly trained body or bodies observed by others at culturally significant places and times to include other forms of organized movements. These other forms include, say, processions, whether formal, the Carmen Saliare, or the more chaotic, the Lupercalia, or say the wild progress of the galley in honor of the mother goddess through the streets of Rome. We can include as well children's games, the song of the Chelicolone or tortoise, or even equestrian displays, the Lusus Troiae. Fernández and Olsen do, however, separate dance in antiquity into two broad categories, while acknowledging there is obvious overlap. First, that occurring in the public sphere, and the second, that occurring in the private. The former most often happens as some form of ritual practice, choral dances, processions, dramatic performances, all of which have the twin function of cohering and reifying the body politic, the topic of Gian Vittore Ungar's chapter, as well as reinforcing the ancient crucial relationship between humans and deities, the topic of La Ferrière's chapter, Gods. The latter form of dance occurring in the private sphere is typically found in Greek symposia or Roman convivia, where lower class but highly skilled bodies of orchestrides and kinaidoi seemingly provoke desire and perhaps disgust in those experiencing their work in close proximity. It's with this second category of dancing that I'd like to focus in on briefly and look at two examples, one literary and one visual, and how the volume addresses both in productive and innovative ways. The two examples feature prominently both in Sarah Olsen's chapter Body and Naomi Weiss's Audience. The first is the pseudo-Virgilian poem The Coper, 38 lines of elegiac couplets, most likely from the 1st century CE, in which the reader meets a tavern hostess, the coper of the poem's title, before a longer direct speech to the reader, exhorting them to stay, relax, take in the multisensory atmosphere of the tavern, and seize the day. Vivite, for death, as he himself reminds us in the poem's last line, is on his way. Venio. The opening description of the hostess here in Weiss's translation proves fruitful for both authors. A tavern keeper, Syrian girl, her head bound with a Greek headdress, skilled at moving her vibrating hips to the castanet's beat, drunkenly, sexily, in a smoky tavern dances, shaking her elbow to the sound of many pipes. Weiss reads this four-line introduction to the following speech as being, in a sense, the synopsis of the coper's performance by a viewer skilled in various dance styles and contexts, such as mime, pantomime, and convivial dance. Furthermore, Weiss encourages us to view the poem's descriptive opening, quote, not as a single snapshot, but as a moving image, capturing multiple visual, kinetic, acoustic, tactile, even olfactory elements of her performance, unquote. Leaning further into the Roman reader's deep literacy with dance, pantomime being especially popular in this period, Weiss connects the four-line description with the longer direct speech in a beautifully productive way, namely as the choreographic text of the coper's performance interpreted and translated into words by the kinetically savvy viewer. Weiss writes, quote, given the scene's connection to pantomime, we might even see it as a sort of parodic literalization of the common idea that the pantomimic dancer can, quote unquote, speak with their body and that their audiences can, quote unquote, hear what they see. In Weiss's reading, then, the poem offers us the dance's imprint on an audience's sensorium, captured for us vividly by our anonymous imperial poet. Sarah Olsen points out how the poem's opening itself constructs a relationship between the coper's body and her identity, rather than merely documenting it. The words and syntax used by the poet render the coper's physical presence an ideological position within her wider culture. She is defined by gender and occupation in the poem's opening word, and then status and ethnicity in its second. Thus, the noun copa, cognate with the more familiar masculine caupo or copo, marks her as female and as a tavern worker. The diminutive adjective suriska belittles her presence somewhat and, as Olsen points out, only implies but does not insist on her having an actual Syrian origin. As Olsen goes on to argue, the copa's Greek headdress, graika metella, and movements tied to other specific locations, in particular the shimmying hips, so often associated with female performers from Gadez or modern-day Cadiz, lends support to a reading where the presentation of the copa simply demarcates her as non-Roman or exotic, a thread taken up in Andujar's chapter, Geography. Olsen thus asks, quote, does this woman dance and labor in this way because she is Syrian, or does she become Suriska through her performance and its context, unquote? Olsen concludes that as a literary artifact, the copa both exposes and participates in the construction of identity through dance. Thus, just say, as Alkmund's Parthenaea create and inscribe through their lyrics the identity of the culturally valuable and marriageable Spartan maiden, so poems such as the copa create non-normative and differently valued identities in their presentation of dance through vocabulary, syntax, and imagery. Leo, if we could have this slide, please. Turning briefly and finally now to dance in visual language, both Olsen and Weiss discuss a red figure kylix depicting an aulos player and a woman dancing, clothed in a skimpy animal print bodice and carrying crotala or castanets. Again, as Olsen notes, this dancer's revealing posture and scant clothing, quote, underscores both the allure and the notional availability of such figures' eroticized bodies, unquote. If we could have the next slide, please. The female skilled solo dancer of the private sphere is once again constructed in counterpoint to the choreute, depicted in consort with her well-draped and decorously poised choral members on a mid-5th century fiale. Once more, dance and its multimedia representations inscribes the person within their community to various degrees of honor and value. And if we could have the final slide, please. Moving out from the arresting picture of the orchestress and her crotala, Weiss also considers the object on which the image appears, a sympathetic drinking cup, and its relation to the cup's user, typically a free, wealthy male. And while in this private setting, there was usually a clear and hierarchical demarcation between audience and performer along lines of gender and status, the intimate proximity between citizen man and the dancing woman often led to explicit forms of contact, a process Weiss points out that is often enacted by an object such as this kylix itself. Thus, quote, as the symposiast drank his wine, the image of these eroticized bodies, the aulos player as well as the dancer, would come tantalizingly into view, available for consumption like the bodies entertaining him with actual music and dance, unquote. Weiss's choice of the word consumption here reminds us of the place of sexuality as an appetitive rather than necessarily a moral concern in the ancient Greek imaginary, as argued by James Davidson in Courtesans and Fishcakes. However, I am particularly struck by the aptness of Weiss using tantalizing in this context. For, while the symposiast appears to get visually and physically closer to the orchestress as he drains the wine from the cup, she will always remain out of reach, not only circumscribed on the visual plane by the red ring surrounding her and her companion pipe player, this orchestress is unreachable too on the material plane, since the concave shape of the kylix only allows the symposiast's desiring lips to graze the cup's edge and not actually touch its central depths where she remains performing undisturbed. Thus, the partygoer, like the mythic Tantalus in the underworld grasping at fruit forever out of reach, can see and sense the dancer, but never fully consume her. Weiss's tantalizing, then, not only reveals a form of motion, and indeed emotion, produced by the ancient cup that oscillates between the subject and object, be that audience and dancer or drinker and cup. Tantalizing also reveals the motion and emotion produced by looking at this source from the modern perspective. Thus, the imprints left on ancient media, viewed through modern scholarship in this wonderful collection of essays, are genuinely sense-provoking and truly tantalizing. We may not ever actually see and apprehend ancient bodies in motion ourselves, but the attempt to reach the unreachable dancer and her dance, undertaken by this exciting new volume, certainly engenders a satisfying and deeply enriching experience. Okay, I'm going to pass it on to Sue now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was just fantastic. Close reading of the Copo, and it saves me having to do it, which is wonderful. What I was thinking was that you can sometimes recognize a good book from its first paragraph, and this is certainly true of Zoa Alonso Fernández and Sarah Olsen's collection of essays, Imprints of Dance in Ancient Greece and Rome. I knew we were in for a stimulating journey from the first sentence of the preface, with their citation of Plutarch's detrimental reference to putting your foot in someone else's chorus, as Thomas told us. This declaration of the editors and authors to embrace that very prohibition as a manifesto filled me with delight and reminded me somewhat of a similar point made by Virginia Woolf in her 1934 piece on Walter Sickert, when she praised those artists who are always making raids into the lands of others. Woolf's expression, which she no doubt borrowed from Plutarch in spite of her claims about not knowing Greek, is particularly appropriate in this case, not least because it shows how the imprint of the ancient world creeps in everywhere into modernist writing. But there's another point to be made. While Zoa and Sarah's collection firmly roots itself in the sense of the originary influence of ancient classical dance, the editors aim to step into the choruses of a plethora of methodologies also reveals, through its deep scholarship and scope, just how often the dances of ancient Greece and Rome were themselves indebted to raiding others' lands and appropriating forms and techniques from within a vast empire, as in fact Tom has just shown with that striking example written about by both Naomi and Sarah in their chapters on the pseudo-Virgilian Copa's Zuriska and that tavern keeper Syrian girl quivering her hips. Thus, from the perspective of dance studies, which is where I'm coming from chiefly in this talk, this meticulous collection opens out to a way of thinking beyond assumptions about ancient Greek and Roman dance and enables us potentially to embrace many other ancient traditions and temporalities. There's a very clever structure here where pieces of evidences, such as, the reference to the Homeric hymn to Apollo, are frequently reintroduced from one chapter to another as evidence, but from quite different perspectives. As the editors tell us, without the benefit of current contemporary sources for dance like video and choreology, how difficult is it to suggest what those actual dances looked like, felt like? Of course, the modern dance artists of the early 20th century were all busy doing just that. Isadora Duncan, Ruby Gina, Margaret Morris, Martha Graham, and so on, as Fiona Macintosh's collection, The Ancient Dance in the Modern World, has already shown us. But in this collection, the author's sophisticated handling of what evidence does exist of artifacts, texts, and other sources pulls off a remarkable feat of scholarly reimagination with their treatments of geography, space, body, audience, movement, objects, politics, and the gods. Furthermore, it provides a convincing as well as dynamic sense of the importance of dancers constituting social, political, communal, and individual identities across discourses of globalization, marginalization, and transnationalism. As a non-classicist, then, when I finished the collection, I felt as if the book had stimulated a new kind of theorization of the treatment of dance and its sources as a whole, and this is meant as a compliment, almost regardless of its rigorous periodization and emphasis on spaces and places apparently restricted to the ancient Mediterranean, This is a collection that all dance scholars, I think, can use. The collection moves imaginatively beyond its core subject matter. To begin with, the conclusion of the chapter on politics by Laura Gian Vittorio Unga, who follows Mark Franco's observation that writing about dance can be a political act in itself. Laura declares that dance scholarship also needs to address its own political implications. Her chapter does this as she explores the way the inclusion of a chapter on politics in the volume is indeed a political act. And she shows how ancient dance often reveals outsider forms of agency, self-determination, popular or secular forms of expression, in addition to its frequent association with institutionalized or religious orthodoxies. The force of this point has, of course, been anticipated elsewhere in the volume. Rosa Andujar's chapter on geography reminds us of the importance of dance as a site of racialization. I thought of Marie-Louise Pratt's concept of contact zones as Rosa invokes the breaking down of reductive binaries, articulating dance in terms of either Greek or barbarian, Roman, foreigner, etc., especially in her discussion of Xenophon's Symposium, where she unlocks the potential for adoption of different identities, centers, and origins of dance. Likewise, Lauren Curtis's chapter on space points to Livy's account that tells us the importation of Etruscan dancers into Rome. But Lauren also emphasizes the situatedness of dance, its potential to shape, disrupt, and transform the spaces where public and private life is conducted. We find a different kind of situatedness in Naomi Weiss's chapter on audience, as Tom has been remarking. But she suggests the distinctive quality of projections of dance that we need to assimilate in order to understand the variety of communal, religious, or spiritual functions of ancient practices. We know that the moderns everywhere were inspired by the so-called classical ideal of spirituality, as in Isadora Duncan or Doris Humphrey. But it's actually D.H. Lawrence's observation of a different ancient tradition altogether that made me think of the distinctive affect or individual forms of chorality. Lawrence's essay on the Hopi snake dance in Arizona in 1924 comes to mind when he stressed the Native American dancers' internalization of their communal movement. As an observer of this dance, he said, "It's not like watching the ballet russe. Please, no clapping or cheering or applause, but remember you are, as it were, in church." Of course, several of the essays read the complexity of available evidence to show the nuances of response, often depending on the degree to which embodied mimetic expression or erotic entertainment, religious ritual, or were participatory or otherwise, or offered spectacle. Who knew, as Zoa tells us through Marshall's Liber Spectacularum, that synchronized swimming and equestrian ballet, Busby Berkeley, and so on, had classical antecedents. In fact, Tom and I might remember that, of course, the little swans in Swan Lake Act 2 are from the Spanish riding school in Vienna, which also had classical antecedents. Anyway, Karen Schlappbach's fascinating chapter on objects brings us to a discussion of kinesthetic props and the uncertain boundaries between object and moving body. There's some wonderful photographs of Loie Full. I should have reproduced them for you here, but go and get the book and look at them as she moves her arms with rods in swirling materials. But Karen also takes us to questions about the identity of the dancing subject. And to me, the impersonality of Yeats's masks come to mind. She alerts us to the enduring discussions of the relationship of puppets and dance. And of course, this was not just an invention of 19th and 20th century followers of Coppelia and Petrushka, but we might also think that Heinrich von Kleist picked up on Plato's laws and Christianizing the idea of the marionette through discussion of the fall. Indeed, Karen's striking discussions of falling bodies and the example of Johann Bourgeois' dance piece, Celui qui tombe, 2014, bizarrely made me think of Milton and his Christianized and choreographed fallen angels in Paradise Lost. Given Karen's discussion of dance exploding the notion of metaphor in her section on bodies and objecthood, I'm sure she's pleased that analytical philosophers like Julie Van Camp and Trevor Whittock still held hotly contested debates on that conundrum of dance and metaphor as recently as the end of the 20th century. Several essays, including Sarah's and Zoa's focus on the relationship of stillness and motility, contribute new perspectives to dance studies theorist Andrei Lepetsky's accounts of stillness and dance. They reveal theoretical relationships of simultaneity and metamorphosis that take us further than Lepetsky's account, I think. And think it makes me think rather of the way that T.S. Eliot's meditation on time in the four quartets has dance as the still point of the turning world, expressing the apparently still but proprioceptive moment of the musculature of the dancer in repose, preparing for action. But Zoa's evocation of stillness and materiality takes us further, especially in her account of the statues of the maidens of the Erechtheion porch, the colonnade at the Acropolis. And it's compelling in conveying the actuality of the ancients' thinking about dance forms in her explorations of the crossovers of rhythmos and incipient chorality of these still, but to our eyes, apparently moving statues. Zoa's discussion of the liveness of language's kineticism also prompts searching questions about the body and the written. That feet were both material and bodily features of rhythm, of course, and lead to her observation that ancient sources return repeatedly to images of dance as a force for transformation and transcendence. A force of transformation. Of course, that immediately made me think of W.B. Yeats's recollection of this force of transformation in his sometimes Neoplatonic writing. Yeats's essay Per amica silentia lunae of 1917 suggests something of Zoa's argument as he shows the degree to which the formality and embodiment of the dance is constitutive of the symbolic idea. He talks about how hitherto shade has communicated with shade in moments of common memory that recur like the figures of a dance in terror or in joy, but now they run together, like to like. Of course, Yeats was at that moment in his life probably familiar at that time with Nietzsche's conclusion to the birth of tragedy and his exhortation to worship at the altars of both Apollo and Dionysus. And these distinctive figures that he talks about in this collection, strikingly suggested as moments of stillness in several theoretical discussions throughout the volume. And especially in Caroline Laferrière's account of schemata, which resonated very much with me after reading Mark Franco's work, Writing Dancing 1573, in which Franco draws on the precedents of Quintilian's analogies between rhetoric and body to show the positioning and stillness of mimetic figures of geometrical dances in the 16th century French court, working in contradistinction to and in tandem with the movements between those poses determined by an authoritative figure. In the case of Caroline's chapter, it's the divine presences. Of course, it's the king in Mark Franco's chapter. I think we could probably talk more about that issue of what goes on between the poses and the issue of gesture. There's so much more, in fact, to be said about the way this book illuminates our thinking about ancient Greek and Roman dance. But I'm just going to finish on that last question of divine dance that Caroline brings up in her discourse on the gods. And she addresses how head on, how do we capture the notion of divine dance from the evidence we have? What is it? Why was it important? How is it conveyed to humans? And in talking of the dance and the written, hasn't narrative theory that we might apply to some of these accounts, always been questioning or opposing this role of divine authority. Carolyn's speculations are most convincing to anyone who's ever danced when she claims for dance the phenomenological affect and effects of sublimity. That dance itself, this is a quotation from Carolyn's chapter, that dance itself could be the medium through which divine presence is experienced and felt within one's own body. My congratulations to you all to this wonderful volume. And I'll hand over now to the editors, Zoa and Sarah.
Wonderful. I think I'm going to start off, right, Zoa? And then I'll pass over to you. First, thank you so much, Tom and Sue, for those thoughtful, generous, invigorating responses. I mean, I know I have so much that I want to chew over and think about and continue to speak with both of you about. But I'm sure I speak for Zoa and for all of the contributors when I say that we are all so grateful to you for engaging with this volume so deeply and thoughtfully and helping us to kind of get it out there in the world. And of course, thanks as well to Fiona and to the archive for hosting this event. So much gratitude. Just very quickly, because I want to leave time for Zoa and for our other contributors who are here as well and other people's questions to speak. But I just want to say, of course, it is always such a privilege and pleasure to hear other people reflect on one's work, right? Because Tom's opening anecdote struck me that, that it is a dance, right? When nobody witnesses it, when you're on your own, when you're in your living room. And I, as a enthusiast of solo dance, I think I'm with you there, Tom, that it is, but also that sometimes writing a book, right, and our scholarly work can feel similarly. It can feel like, does it count when we just do it in isolation? And even for a project as collaborative as this one, there's of course a feeling when it goes out in the world, there's a question whether it will be visible to other people, right? Or whether the connections and the goals and arguments that we all had for this book will be visible to others. And so of course it's wonderful to hear both Tom and Sue reflect on some of the choices that we made very intentionally to return to certain key texts and objects at various junctures in the chapters, to put the chapters in a particular order, right? So to foreground certain kinds of conversations between them. It's wonderful to hear you highlight and reflect and expand on those things. But it's also so wonderful to hear you notice things and make connections that wouldn't have occurred to me, certainly. Sue, your comments about Woolf, Lawrence, T.S. Eliot, so much to think about. And this is another thing we really hoped for with this volume, right? Is that it would not be a final word, but that it would be the start of a conversation. And it would be a way to invite more people into this world of dance and ancient dance and its imprints, and create ways to continue the conversation, not simply to close it off or to offer a kind of definitive end to it. Zoa, can I hand things over to you? Maybe we can.
Yes, well, I wish you've seen me. I had no camera off for all these wonderful presentations because I've been smiling, nodding, and my bodily movement was all about, thanking you, Sue and Tom, and of course Fiona and the whole team of organizers at the archive, because to us, as Sarah was saying, this has been really heaven somehow. We've been really comfortable and agreeing in every of the remarks you've been doing, and I just wanted to keep thanking people here, and I wanted to go one step further and thank as well all my colleagues within the team, Sarah and all the other authors, because since the very beginning, before the pandemic, right before the pandemic, but throughout the pandemic, and then after all, we've been collaborating together, thinking together. We've been very generous to each other, coming from different backgrounds, from different fields of expertise. And it has been so enriching, to the extent that even in this very moment, I really need to acknowledge the fact that we perform a very bold move by deciding to publish this book where we've done it. This is a very unknown press at a very small university, a very poor public Spanish institution, but we all wanted to make this move, and we wanted to make it happen because not only the book is going to be open access and everybody is going to be able to download it, but also we wanted to decenter a little bit things and to make these cross collaborative dynamic happen as well with our readers throughout the world. We expect to have our Spanish volume soon. This is what I've got for the moment. I just have this bookmarker, but there's going to be a Spanish translation of the entire volume, which will also be open access for free in the coming months. So we're very grateful for the patience of the colleagues and for the people at the archive helping us to disseminate this work, because I think that's interesting and important to know. So I don't think I have more things to say, because I really need to rewatch the video and enjoy the wonderful things that Tom and Sue have been saying.
I've learned so much from all of you dancers, and I absolutely echo what you've said about the need for not just people who work on performance, but philologists to seriously engage with the work that you've been doing. And the point I made before in relation, I think it was to Tom's book, but also a number of people who I know who've been on the call, that performance in antiquity, in particularly in late antiquity, is essential for any one who's working on modern performance. So I join everyone in saying I recognize that this is a really significant volume. I love the way it's been put together, the best kind of scholarship. And I know obviously relationships forged through it are going to be very important, but I know that it's going to be really valuable for not just the undergraduates who've joined us today, but undergraduates in the future, as well as seasoned scholars as well. But this is my moment to thank everyone. I hugely grateful to the respondents who've been so generous as ever with their responses, and for sharing, Sarah and Zoa, your wonderful work with us. And finally, I just want to thank Leo, who, as ever, has been so brilliant behind the scenes. So thank you all, and look forward to seeing you at various events going forward, and hopefully in many cases in person too. So good night to everyone. Goodbye.